The dust had not been disturbed in over a century when the attic lock finally gave way. A single shaft of light cut through the stale air, settling on a large, gilt-framed photograph leaning against the far wall. Welcome to Forgotten Soul Stories, where the past is never truly buried. The portrait showed a family frozen in perfect Victorian stillness, their expressions carefully arranged for the long exposure of 1892. Father seated, mother standing, 3 children aligned like props in a theatre of domestic pride. Everything appeared ordinary at first glance, almost comforting in its symmetry. Almost. Next to the father's chair, resting partly in shadow, was something no one could immediately name. Historians would later insist it was not a trick of light, nor damage to the plate. Whatever it was, it occupied space, cast a shadow, and seemed deliberately positioned. The longer one stared, the more the air in the room felt compressed, as if the photograph itself were still holding its breath, waiting for someone foolish enough to truly see it. The portrait was discovered during the clearance of the Hawthorne estate, a property abandoned since the early 20th century and rumored to have bankrupted every family that tried to restore it. Tucked behind a false wall in the attic, the photograph was wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with black wax, an unnecessary precaution for something supposedly harmless. The archivist who unwrapped it noted an immediate drop in temperature, though the attic windows were shut and the summer heat outside was oppressive. At first glance, the image appeared to be a conventional family portrait, the kind commissioned to preserve lineage and respectability. The father sat rigidly in a carved wooden chair, hands folded, gaze steady. The mother stood behind him, her face pale but composed. 3 children flanked them, their postures unnaturally disciplined for such a young age. Yet the longer the archivist studied the image, the more the balance of the scene began to feel wrong. The spacing between the figures was precise, almost ritualistic, as though measured rather than arranged. Then attention was drawn to the space beside the chair. At first it resembled a distortion in the photographic emulsion, a smudge common to plates of that era. But magnification revealed texture, edges, and a shape that suggested intention. It was not furniture, nor shadow, nor an animal. It appeared to be something placed there deliberately, something the family had posed with as naturally as one might pose with a cherished heirloom. The archivist searched estate inventories for mention of unusual objects, but found none. No sculptures, no ceremonial artifacts, no recorded curiosities. Even more unsettling was the absence of a 4th child in official records, despite the photograph clearly suggesting space had been made for one. The figure beside the chair seemed to occupy the role of that absence, a stand-in for someone who could not be named. When the photograph was catalogued and sent for further analysis, several historians independently reported the same sensation while viewing it, a feeling of being observed from within the image. One researcher claimed the children's eye seemed subtly misaligned when viewed in peripheral vision, always angled toward the object. Another noted that the father's hand appeared strained, as though resisting the urge to reach toward it. The object itself defied description, not because it was unclear, but because the mind refused to settle on a single interpretation, shifting between organic and artificial, familiar and impossible, as if the photograph were actively preventing recognition, guarding a secret that had already ruined one family and was now patiently waiting to be remembered again. When the portrait was transferred to a controlled archival lab, historians expected clarification. High-resolution scanning, infrared analysis, spectral imaging, modern tools had solved older mysteries. Instead, the technology only deepened the unease. Under magnification, the edges of the unknown figure beside the chair appeared sharper than the rest of the photograph, as though it had been impressed onto the plate with greater permanence. The grain of the emulsion behaved differently in that region, resisting digital enhancement as if layered over something beneath the surface. One technician adjusted the contrast, and for a fraction of a second, the outline seemed to shift, not dramatically, not enough to accuse the mind of hallucination, but enough to make him reset the calibration twice. Infrared imaging revealed faint impressions not visible to the naked eye. Around the children's shoes, subtle pressure marks suggested they had not been standing on flat floorboards but on something uneven, something slightly raised. Yet in the visible spectrum, the ground appeared perfectly smooth. The father's chair cast a shadow consistent with a single light source positioned to the left, typical of studio portraits from 1892. The object beside the chair, however, cast two shadows, one faint and elongated, another shorter and sharper, implying conflicting light directions. There was no historical precedent for such an anomaly in wet plate photography without deliberate manipulation, and experts agreed the technique required for such alteration did not exist at the time. As the image was processed through motion enhancement software designed to detect degradation patterns, something stranger occurred. Sequential renders of the same scan, taken minutes apart, produce slight variations in pixel density around the object. The archivist initially blamed compression errors. Yet when the raw files were compared, the differences remained. The object's outline appeared marginally closer to the chair in the second scan, its edge grazing the carved leg that, in the first render, it had not touched. Measurements were taken. The displacement was less than a millimeter, but it was measurable. The children's faces yielded further discomfort. When facial recognition mapping was applied to reconstruct bone structure, the program repeatedly flagged inconsistencies in their gaze alignment. Though their eyes appeared forward-facing, depth analysis suggested their focus converged toward the space beside the chair. It was as if every member of the family, consciously or not, had centered their attention on that presence. Even the mother's posture, once thought rigid from the long exposure time, now appeared subtly angled inward, shoulders tilted toward the anomaly. The most troubling discovery came during ultraviolet exposure. Beneath the surface of the plate, faint handprints emerged around the base of the object, small, child-sized impressions pressed into the emulsion before it fully set, as though someone had reached toward it during development, leaving behind evidence not of accident, but of contact that seemed preserved not just in silver and glass, but in something far less willing to remain still. The deeper the historians dug into parish registries and municipal census rolls, the more the Hawthorne family appeared to dissolve at the edges of official history. Church baptismal records from 1883 to 1891 confirmed the births of 3 children, Edmund, Clara, and Thomas, matching the 3 young figures visible in the portrait. Tax records listed the father, Alastair Hawthorne, as a prosperous importer of industrial machinery, and property deeds verified the family's ownership of the estate well into the late 1890s. On paper, everything aligned neatly with the image, except for the space beside the chair. The composition of Victorian portraiture was rarely accidental. Photographers arranged families carefully, balancing symmetry and symbolism. Yet in this photograph, there was an unmistakable allowance, a deliberate gap between the youngest child and the father's chair, a space that seemed intended for a fourth presence. An overlooked marginal note in a fragile parish ledger altered the investigation. Beside the Hawthorne surname, faintly scratched rather than inked, was a name partially erased, E.N. The rest had been scraped away so thoroughly that the parchment fibers were torn. The archivist handling the document described the erasure as violent, not administrative. It had not been crossed out with ink, nor corrected with a clerical annotation. It had been physically removed. Cross-referencing burial records from the same year revealed something stranger still: no record of a fourth Hawthorne child's death, no grave marker, no funeral mass, no mention in obituaries. It was as though the name had been excised without the closure of mortality. Census data from 1891 recorded for dependents in the Hawthorne household. Yet the column listing names included only 3. The fourth entry bore only a dash. Investigators initially suspected clerical error, but the handwriting was deliberate and consistent with the enumerator's script throughout the page. In personal letters exchanged between Alastair Hawthorne and a business associate in Manchester, one passage stood out. He wrote of managing the condition within the home and expressed relief that the matter would soon be resolved. There was no elaboration, no context, only the quiet urgency of a man attempting to contain something. Local folklore collected decades later from descendants of neighboring families hinted at a child who did not take to sunlight and was kept from the public eye. One account described shutters nailed shut on the estate's eastern wing and a physician summoned repeatedly at dusk. Yet no medical logs survived, and no physician in the district claimed association with the family during that period. The deliberate erasure suggested intention, not tragedy. Someone had removed a person not only from memory but from documentation, severing them from history itself. And still, the portrait remained, fixed evidence that the space beside the chair was never empty, that something, or someone, had once stood there, acknowledged by the lens even as ink and paper conspired to deny their existence, leaving the photograph as the only witness that refused to forget the object beside the chair resisted identification for weeks, not because it lacked detail, but because every attempt to classify it produced contradictions. Sculptural experts dismissed it as too irregular to be carved stone. Textile historians ruled out drapery, its surface showed no weave under magnification. Taxidermists argued it was not an animal form, as there was no anatomical symmetry, no skeletal structure implied beneath the contours. Yet it possessed dimension and mass, confirmed by the way light bent subtly along its edge and by the pressure marks detected in the floorboards beneath it. Eventually, a specialist in 19th-century spiritualist artifacts was consulted, a scholar who had spent decades studying séance equipment, mourning effigies, and ritual objects created during the height of Victorian occult fascination. He studied the scan for less than a minute before leaning back in his chair, his expression drained of color. He identified parallels not in shape, but in context. During the late 1800s, particularly after the rise of the spiritualist movement in Europe and America, certain private circles experimented with containment vessels, objects believed to house or anchor entities summoned during séances. Most documented examples were crude constructions, wooden boxes etched with sigils, glass jars sealed with wax, or sculpted effigies designed to resemble distorted human forms. None matched the object in the Hawthorne portrait exactly. But the scholar pointed to its placement, directly beside the patriarch, positioned at equal height to a seated adult's torso. That was not decorative placement. It was relational. It implied status. Further analysis revealed faint etchings along the object's surface, nearly invisible unless viewed at extreme contrast levels. The markings were not decorative flourishes but repeated linear symbols, shallow yet deliberate. Linguists were consulted, and while no complete alphabet emerged, the shapes bore unsettling resemblance to protective sigils recorded in obscure spiritualist manuals published in the 1870s, manuals that warned of the danger of failing to properly anchor what had been invited into a domestic space. One passage from an 1874 tract described the need for a vessel sufficient to bear the weight of presence, lest it disperse among the living. The phrasing was metaphorical, yet the object's mass in the photograph suggested something literal. What forced the historians into silence was a final discovery, when the dimensions of the object were estimated using perspective calculations from the known height of the father's chair. Its scale aligned disturbingly well with that of a child approximately 6 years of age. Not a sculpture of a child, but a volume equivalent to one compressed inward, as though human proportion had been folded into something dense and unyielding. The scholar who had first recognized the parallels refused further involvement after reviewing this calculation, stating only that some objects were never meant to be captured by light, because light fixes what should remain fluid, and once fixed, it can no longer be dismissed as imagination. The portrait was secured in a climate-controlled archive, isolated from public exhibition. Yet its influence did not remain confined to glass and frame. The first incident was minor, easily dismissed. A graduate researcher assigned to catalogue associated documents reported recurring dreams in which she stood in the Hawthorne attic, staring at the photograph while something shifted just outside her peripheral vision. She insisted that in the dream, the space beside the chair was empty at first, but gradually filled as though condensing from shadow. Within a week, she requested reassignment, citing exhaustion and an unshakable sensation of being watched while working alone. Others experienced subtler effects. A historian specializing in Victorian domestic life began to fixate on the composition of the portrait, rearranging furniture in his own study to mirror its symmetry. Colleagues noticed he had positioned a spare chair beside his desk, leaving a deliberate gap next to it. When asked why, he struggled to articulate an answer, claiming only that the balance mattered. Security footage later showed him standing in front of the archived photograph after hours, his posture angled slightly inward, shoulders tilted the same way the mother's had been in 1892. Digital anomalies escalated. Backup files of the scanned image corrupted repeatedly, but only in the region containing the object. Restoration attempts produced faint distortions extending beyond the original outline, as though the boundaries were expanding incrementally. Measurements taken over successive weeks suggested a fractional increase in pixel occupation, insignificant to casual observers, yet statistically measurable. The archivists debated environmental interference, electromagnetic fluctuations, even sabotage. None could explain why the rest of the image remained stable. The most disturbing parallel emerged when researchers uncovered records of the Hawthorne estate's final months. Newspaper clippings described neighbors complaining of persistent knocking sounds emanating from within the sealed house after the family withdrew from public life. One article mentioned that deliveries of food ceased abruptly in late autumn of 1893, yet no bodies were officially recovered from the property. The estate was eventually abandoned without formal declaration of death. It was as though the family had simply receded, leaving structure and belongings intact. Months into the investigation, a night guard monitoring the archive reported hearing faint tapping from the storage room where the portrait was kept. Assuming rodents, he entered with a flashlight. The room was undisturbed, temperature steady, humidity controlled. Yet when he reviewed the security feed afterward, he noticed something he could not explain. During the minutes he stood inside, his body orientation had gradually shifted. Frame by frame, he had turned toward the storage case containing the portrait until he was facing it directly, mirroring the inward angle seen in the photograph. He had no memory of moving. By the time the board considered removing the image from study entirely, 5 separate staff members had described the same intrusive thought while viewing it, the inexplicable certainty that the space beside the chair was not a relic of the past but an invitation, a place deliberately left open, waiting not for recognition, but for replacement.